Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about some of the things that are going on in the world and nationally, internationally, locally that may have an impact on you and some of the things that you are involved in. And a lot of it is just kind of a general discussion of some of the things that are out there, and from an economic standpoint, what impact they might have on you here in little old Stewart. Some of the things we generally talk about are related to finance or economics nationally and internationally and locally, and just to kind of discuss it. It is a call-in show. If you've got a comment, 220-9788, 220-WSTU is the number in the studio here, and that's a number that you can write down and save and use. It is the studio number. A lot of the other shows on WSTU are call-in or allow comments, and also, you've got that number in the morning in case you need to report a traffic incident or something going on in the community to Evan and Bonnie. So, again, 220-9788, 220-WSTU is that number in the studio. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA and have had my own practice here in Stewart for some 25 years. Prior to that, I was in private industry. I didn't come from public accounting. I was originally in public accounting when I graduated from college. I went to Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois, the home of the Fighting Bulldogs. Anyway, we graduated and went to work for Arthur Andersen in Chicago and worked in their banking division for a few years, and then moved back to my hometown of Peoria and worked for McGladrey for a few years in the banking industry, and then went to work in a bank, and later in my career was involved in starting banks. So I've had an opportunity, fortunately, to see a lot of different economic issues and financial issues, and how they play out, and what the alternatives are. Banking is an interesting profession because, as it relates to finance, a lot of times you're on the cutting edge because you're either dealing with it internally in terms of the management of finance within the bank itself, which was a lot of my responsibility as chief financial officer of a fairly large $600 million bank, and then also as a chief operating officer. So, you get to see a lot, but then also you get to see a lot of the things that play out with your customers in the banking industry. A lot of the banks in the old days used to make things go financially and capital wise. They were the primary lenders, as opposed to, say, today the government's the primary lender, really. But in those days, the banks were the primary lenders, so they spent time getting to understand your business, so that they could understand the risks and how it worked. And it was a good opportunity for me. I had an opportunity to deal with that, and of course, with Arthur Andersen being in the banking division, which is where I was at, we spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time dealing with banks' finances and how to manage banks' finances and that kind of thing. And so it's been an interesting experience. I will be the first to say that you do learn more from the bad things than the good things. The pats on the back don't last as long as the knives in the side. It's a lot. You learn a lot more from that. But anyway, so that's kind of my background, just, so where I come from on some things. Politically, this is not technically a political show, but anytime you're talking about national finances and macroeconomics and all of those kind of things, you're talking about government policy. So naturally there is some political fallout from some of the decisions that are made, because economics is it is a science. It's funny because it's like with a lot of science, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. We don't always know the answer. But on the other hand, there are a lot of other situations where we do know the answer and we know what happens. We've done it and we've seen what the outcome was, and we do it again and maybe vary it, but we get the same outcome ultimately. And that's one of the things that makes it an interesting field of study. The funny thing is that as an accountant and a CPA, a lot of times CPAs have a really hard time and are kind of at odds with the economic concepts of income and expense and things like that, because they're not always consistent with the the financial aspects of income and expense. For example, I talk on the show all the time about about uh, C corporations, big publicly traded corporations that pay tax, that they don't pay tax because they're a cost economically that just gets passed on, has to be passed on. Otherwise, the entity can't survive. And as I've said before, you can tax a corporation. And every time you hear somebody talk about taxing a corporation, the first thing that should come in your mind is that corporations cannot pay taxes. And I don't know why people don't talk about that, but here's the reason why. Economically, and again, I don't care what it shows on the financial statements. You see on the financial statements, they got numbers and there's taxes and you'll have financial statement taxes and you'll have income taxes and you'll have deferred taxes and all that kind of stuff from a financial standpoint. And yeah, and it's an item that shows it reduces their income and all of that kind of thing. But economically, from an economic perspective, income taxes, fall into a category of costs. And so economically, a company has either has income and they have costs. Now, sometimes the income is money coming in that on the accounting side we wouldn't think of income, might be capital or something else, but they do have money coming in. And then economically, they have costs. They have generally three types of costs. They have material costs, they have labor costs, and then the third cost that they have is are tax costs. So they take their income and you reduce, you take that income and you reduce from that income those three costs. And that is the return to the investor. So it's the investor that ultimately would bear the cost of the taxes, not the corporation, even though the corporation pays it. When the corporation pays it and they pay that cost reduces the return to the investor. And so you say, okay, well, that's all right. Then the investor's paying, that's what we want, but we're just not going to tell anybody. Well, yeah, but that's not really solely how it works. The way that it works is that the taxes that are collected, if the company's job, and in a free market system, even a regulated system, the company is going to try to maximize the return to the shareholders, to the investors. Why? Well, because if they don't produce a return consistent with the risk associated with it, or the perceived risk of that company, then the investor will leave. And so let's say that I'm looking at two companies, and one is a public utility, and it's regulated, it's guaranteed an income because it's a regulated industry. And I'm looking at that, and they maybe they're returning a say a 3% return on their investment. And then I'm looking at over here, I'm looking at another utility company, and they also supposedly are heavily regulated, and they're producing a 6% return. Well, and if that situation is maintained for any period of time, the investors will shift from the first utility to the second utility, because with no additional risk, they're getting an additional 3%. So why could that be? Why does that happen, or why could that be? Well, one, it could be that the first utility was exposed to some sort of additional regulation. Let's say, for example, it's in California, and there's additional environmental rules in California that force that entity to pay additional costs. Well, if it's not able to reduce its labor costs or reduce its material costs, then then it's going to be at a disadvantage. So if I've got two choices, a utility down in Florida that is maybe not subject to the regulations and furthermore has no state income tax for its investors, and I'm looking at a California that's heavily regulated environmentally and has a 13% income tax on top of the federal tax, I'm going to I'm going to get a better return just for the tax situation out of the Florida situation. So, assuming there's no additional difference between those two entities other than their costs due to regulation or whatever or taxes, I'm going to go to the one that provides the higher return, right? Why not? And you say, well, that's these big investors. They're not big investors. That's the other thing. If they were big investors, you could somewhat control them because you could force them to pay taxes. If, for example, all utilities in the United States were owned by one person, then yeah, that person's ultimately paying the tax because they would either have to sell that investment or they have to pay the tax. But they're not. Most of the publicly traded companies in the United States that are the ones that we're talking about are owned by retirement plans. They're owned first of all um, by mutual funds, various kinds of mutual funds. You've all seen them. There's an S&P mutual fund. There's managed mutual funds. There's uh, exchange traded funds. There's all kinds of different funds, right? Who owns those funds? Well, I guarantee you, if you've got any retirement money, you've probably got money in one of those funds, which has money in any of these publicly traded companies. The Dow is the 30 largest companies. So if you've got money in a Dow mutual fund that mirrors the Dow, then it has it has an investment in those companies. So these lifestyle funds that many of you have, those are same thing. They're same type of things, bonds and stocks of the publicly traded companies. So it's really you. It's you, the teachers union, the largest. I think one of the largest investors in the United States is the California Teachers Union. They control it. So it's not some wealthy person sitting out here on Jupiter Island or down in Palm Beach clipping coupons. That's generally not who it is. They have other alternatives in ways that they can invest inshore, offshore, into alternative investments. In fact, the big thing right now is that instead of mutual funds, many of the wealthier families in the United States have family offices, and they may have their own financial advisor and broker, or they may deal with somebody at one of the bigger firms, but they individually manage their family's money, and that money is big enough, and you have to have a certain amount to participate in these programs. It has to be not a publicly traded type thing. It used to be that anybody could be involved in some of these hedge funds, they called them, or family office type programs. They were like their own mutual funds. Now, recently, because there were so many people trying to get in these and avoid the regular mutual funds, they tightened up on those types of funds. And now some of the largest in the United States that used to kind of trade publicly in and out, people get money putting it in, and every, the average person, the teacher, they could put their money in it. Now can't. They've cut those off, and you have to, with most of those, you have to be, it has to be more closely held. Otherwise, it has to be regulated like the mutual funds are. And that's, of course, what makes allowed these venture capital funds and these hedge funds to be able to generate higher levels of income, because they could invest in a fairly risky type ventures because it was their own money largely. So they could invest in viaticals, which are insurance policies that are sold on people. You have viaticals, you had mortgages, other forms of alternative investments companies, sometimes startup companies, things like that. So anyway, what what's happened is that's how, what kind of business that's how business actually is working, and economically, it's really as simple as the fact that there are really three costs, and those three costs uh, have they they have to be controlled so that the investor is able to produce a um, a level of return that's consistent with the risk that's associated with it. So, like I say, if if I'm in California and have a business in California, my taxes are going to be higher. So I have to do something else. I either have to reduce my labor costs, or I have to reduce my material costs, or um, I have to be a monopoly, which of course a utility is. Um, so I've got to do something to produce an advantage for me. Now, here's the other good thing about an interesting thing about economics in a free enterprise system, and I'm going to kind of explain what that means because a lot of people assume everything is free enterprise and it's not. In a free enterprise system, you have uh, investors or companies will always work to produce an optimum level of costs. So, if you say, "Oh, we'll increase taxes," um, just let them reduce their labor costs or their material costs. Well, that seems like, well, that okay, we'll do that. But how do you do that and maintain the same quality of product in a competitive environment? Because let's say, for example, I'm using I'm using uh, U.S. steel in my product, and my competitor is using U.S. steel, and so we have a good American-made U.S. product that's attractive to investors, and so they want to buy our product because it's made in America. Um, but now you've increased my taxes, so I've got to reduce my cost of something. Well, I can cut my labor contracts, but the unions have probably already negotiated pretty good. I mean, they've negotiated a fair rate because if I don't pay them what's been negotiated, they will stop working through a strike, or they will pick up and go to another union shop, and I will be left with maybe no employees or no skilled employees. So, and I'm subject to collective bargaining anyway, and that collective bargaining allowed the employees who are a big base to be more of an equal with the company. So let's assume that we've already negotiated a pretty good labor contract. So I can't really cut labor. I could use technology to cut jobs. I could reduce my labor costs by increasing my uh, material type costs, if especially if that is technology, and that technology reduces the need for labor, artificial intelligence. So that's what's happening right now, for example, as businesses are starting to see certain costs go up, including labor costs, and they start mechanizing it. And labor costs have gone up for two reasons. Prior to the pandemic, they were going up because there was a push on nationwide to try to increase the minimum wage. Well, when they increase the minimum wage, the business, again, that's a cost. They have to reduce some other cost, which presumably they've already done as good as they can in reducing those costs because they're, again, trying to maximize their return on investment so their investors will stay put. So they go out there and they try to do something else. That's why Wendy's has kiosks now. That's why McDonald's has kiosks, and all of those jobs went away. And you could say, well, those weren't good jobs. Well, here's the definition of a good job. If I need money and I can't find work and somebody offers me a job that pays me, that's a good job. I mean, let's face it. Uh, that is what it's all about for me as an employee. Is I need to feed my family. I need to take care of my kids, grandkids, all of those kind of things. I have certain basic requirements. So I have to work. I can't stay at home and get a paycheck and not work. This doesn't work that way. And in fact, even if the government would send me money, everybody else has got to pay for it, and then eventually everybody else is getting free money, and so nobody's paying for it. That's basic economics. But but I guess what I'm saying is that it is a situation where businesses make adjustments, and they may have held off on some of those adjustments because they didn't need to make it, because everybody was kind of in the same boat. But uh, when when I start increasing costs of a certain type of business, like let's say McDonald's and Wendy's, um, they they have a certain product within the restaurant industry that meets a need price wise. It's a lower cost product. That was the idea. McDonald's originally, it was also time. You could get the thing quickly, which actually reduces your cost. If you're an employee and you've got a certain limited amount of time for lunch, you could go to McDonald's, you could get waited on in less than a minute, and you could get in and eat and go back to work and not lose any time at your employer, and still be able to eat lunch. So all of those met a need, and they're at that level of need where they were basically competing on price. There's very few people that are sitting out there at the end of the day going, should I go to McDonald's for dinner tonight or the Gafford? That's that those aren't competing products. That's just not usually where people are at. Um, so what happens is, if I reduce when I start putting an artificial increase on the McDonald's and Wendy's of the world, then I'm going to end up with a situation that my costs rise compared to other competitors in that market, and the next thing you know, I either have to increase my price, which if I increase my price enough, I my customers are now into a different market. Maybe not the Gafford market, but they might be into the PA barbecue market or the Bono's market. So so that's where I guess is what's happening. So what does McDonald's and Wendy's do? Well, they have to mechanize it so they can eliminate some of their labor costs. The only way to eliminate labor costs is to again reduce the number of jobs using technology, or using technology, increase the productivity of the workers you've got, so that they produce more for the same amount of wage. And then at that point, I'm in effect selling more per hour, if you want to look at it that way. It's costing me less per hour because I'm producing more with a limited amount of workforce. So when I start looking at the total number of labor hours it takes to produce a certain level of product, let's say I'm going to produce 1,000 widgets, and in the past it's taken 5 employees 40 hours a week. So I've got 200 hours to produce those 1,000 widgets. So it's 200 hours to produce the 1,000 widgets. So it's 5 hours per widget basically. Um, Now, if all of a sudden I reduce that from 5 people working 40 hours a week, through productivity gains, maybe they don't have to make the patties by hand, or they don't have to, they don't have to wash the dishes by hand or whatever. Those were all productivity gains. So if I increase that productivity, now those 5 employees working 200 hours a week are now able to produce 2,000 widgets, right? 2,000 widgets. Same people, working the same amount of hours, but through productivity, they're now able to produce more widgets. So my cost per widget has gone down, right? So I've reduced my labor cost, not by cutting people, but by increasing productivity. Well, the flip side of that works. That's why we've got a problem economically in the pandemic right now, is that productivity has actually gone down. People are now working from home, and I've had people working at home. We've had a virtual office and a virtual firm for almost 20 of the 25 years. And for 5 years before that, we were all pretty technology oriented in terms of distributed working conditions. So I'm pretty much familiar with the whole idea of distributed employees, and and I'm going to tell you, it requires major modifications to keep productivity levels up. Um, Modifications that have not been made. People are not as effective working at home. I know there's a bunch of employees that will love to continue to work at home. Why? Well, because you can do other things. You can get other things done, and it gives you, so you can say, well, I'm not going to take a lunch. I'm going to do the laundry. And then the next thing you know, well, I can throw a load of laundry in on my break, and then I'll just go get it later. And by the way, who's going to know? And so what actually happens, and it is that people do not work as productively at home in general, unless there's some measure to force them to. For example, in most businesses that work with a distributed at-home workforce, uh, their compensation is tied to production directly. You have to produce so many jobs, you have to produce so many reports, you have to process so many invoices, you have to do whatever. Those are all based on productivity levels, and that's how you measure it. You may still pay them a salary, but that salary is measured by productivity. So if the person, now that's a good thing. If you're very, very productive, um, then you may actually have some extra hours, or you may get a promotion because you're able to do more. But that's what happens in. But what generally happens is that unless there is a check and balance, which at home there's not quite the ability to do that. Nobody's looking over your shoulder a lot of times when you're doing certain things. So they don't know if you've cut any corners, or if you were distracted when something happened and you forgot to do something here or something there. But I can guarantee you that unless labor is tied to productivity, in a distributed work environment, you're going to have a reduction in productivity. What does that mean? Well, we just talked about it. A reduction in productivity means an increase in labor costs. So now your labor costs have gone up. So what has to happen? Either the price of your product has gone up, which if you're in a competitive market, you can't raise your price arbitrarily because somebody else isn't going to, and you'll lose all your business. So you got to either raise your price or you got to reduce another cost. Well, if all of a sudden all of those costs are starting to hit, let's say we have to increase tax costs because we've distributed so much money in this pandemic that we've got to eventually pay it back. So we've borrowed, or we've got money that we've got to pay back. So we've increased our costs, we've increased our debt costs, and financing costs, which is reducing our return to our investors. We've increased our labor costs because our productivity has gone down. Potentially, we've increased our materials costs because customers are saying, I want to buy American, I don't want to buy Chinese. And so the China market or the Indian market that we were originally tapping for reduced labor or reduced material costs, we're not buying from that market. Maybe that market is restricted right now. We can't even buy in that market, or there's tariffs that are causing that market to go up. So what do? Well, we either have to be willing to accept a lower return on investment for the investors across the board. That is unlikely, because if it was like the previous depression where your choices were limited, you may be willing to accept a lower return. But that's not where it is right now. We're in a global economy. So I don't have to choose to sell just to the United States. I don't have to deal with just the United States. I can go and try to peddle my product in Germany or France or Switzerland or wherever, the UK. And so, at that point, I now have competitors that I didn't really have before. Japan being a major competitor that I didn't have before. So at this point, that's kind of where we are economically. I mean, it's lining up for a disaster, and the disaster in a free market system is a depression. Um, I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again because I think it's kind of important to understand. Free enterprise systems, uh, left to their own accord, are very brutal. They don't care how old you are. They don't care what your skin color is. They don't care anything about any of that. The market doesn't care. It is not a racist. It is not. It doesn't in a free enterprise system. Those factors don't come into play. The market is just brutally honest. It produces a result. Now, there are very few free markets. There are some, but to have a free market, you have to have equal buyers and sellers. That in general can mean equal numbers, but it really means equal weight. In other words, there has to be strength, equal strength on both sides of the negotiating table. If I'm the utility I talked about before, and you're 7,000 people, right? Um, you may be a large number of buyers, but I am a very large, strong seller. And furthermore, I'm guaranteed a profit by the government. So that is a highly regulated market because it is not a free market. There's no free entry into the market. See, normally, if I was a big seller like that, normally, and I was able to dictate price, that wouldn't last very long because somebody else would start another utility and somebody else would start another utility. And then next thing you know, there would be thousands of utilities and thousands of customers. And so therefore price would reach equilibrium, which is defined as a fair price. When in a competitive market, the price reaches stabilization where there are equal numbers of buyers and sellers that are willing to buy at that price. That's equilibrium, which by definition is a fair price economically. You might not like the price, but it's a fair price economically. But why doesn't that happen in the regulated industries division? Well, most people don't have, $200 billion to build a nuclear power plant or whatever it takes. So kind of the barrier to entry, they call it, the barrier to entry for a company in that market is very, very high. And so therefore, you're not going to have people jump in. Let's I'll tell you a perfect example, like right now on the other side of it, in the technology world. People complain right now about Facebook, and they complain about Facebook, regulating what's being said and stifling conversations. Why don't people go to something else? Well, because there really isn't anything yet equivalent in nature to Facebook. Twitter's not the same, and even that. So when you look at alternatives for getting your word out, whether it be politically, socially, or business wise, there are very few choices, and those choices are generally monopolies or oligopolies. Oligopolies are generally 4 or less competitors. So you don't have competition. So therefore, you don't have a fair price. And price is not necessarily just literal dollars. In the case of technology, fair price is the ability to get your word out. That you don't have that. You're not going to have that in that situation because the entity that's controlling you getting your word out is doesn't have any competition. So they can censor, they can stifle, they can change, they can do whatever they want to do. They can delist you, they can put you in Facebook jail, they can do whatever they want to do because they don't really have an online competition at this point. Why doesn't somebody start it? Well, first of all, there's some technology issues that are probably proprietary that make it harder to do that. So that cost is there because the patent to do that I may not be able to get, and Facebook may not be willing to sell it to me. So therefore, I may not be able to compete exactly the same. And so that's it. There's the barrier technology wise. There's a barrier capital wise. How long would it take you to get another form of business up and running? How long would you have to lose money? How long did Facebook lose money before they were able to get to the point that they finally generated money? Um, Interestingly enough, Facebook doesn't really sell a product. They are strictly an advertising company. All of their revenue is advertising. So I guess if you could find another advertising medium that would be attractive to people, that they could converse while people advertise, I guess you could compete with them. But right now, that's not available. So that's kind of why there are very few. When you start looking at some of the from a government perspective, well, when should the government step in? And I hear Republican senators and Congress people all the time say, no, we need to not be, this is free enterprise. Government should not be, creating rules or intervening in what's going on in the free market. And I agree with that. That is a pure 100%. I agree with that statement 100%. The problem is you need to define, you being the Congress people, need to define a free market. I guarantee you the markets that AOL and Google and Facebook are living in are not free markets. They are not free markets. They were when they started. They were a little tiny, small company without much power against thousands of people. And so if they didn't do what the people wanted, the people would have shut them down. Remember something called MySpace? It was out there, right? And then all of a sudden, it didn't meet the needs, and there was some competition, and boom, it went away. But what's going on now is, who's competing with Amazon? Who's competing with? They've put people out of business. I mean, they've kind of taken control. And this pandemic just solidified. They're now the major retail distribution and marketing company in the world. And think about that a minute. They control every product you see, where that product comes from, how you use that product, whether you can get it in the future, how it's delivered to you, how fast it's delivered to you, what alternative they're going to give you if it's not available. They control all of the aspects of the distribution chain on millions and millions of products. They may not make them all, but if you control the ability of that company to get their product to market, because they create artificial increases, they do rules that they can get away with it. What's your choice? If you make a choice now that you're not going to sell on Amazon, and you're a large retailer, where are you going? Brick and mortar? Well, what's happening there? They can't compete. They're not being able to compete on brick and mortar. Why? Because the customer likes the convenience of buying online. But you got to remember, when you're doing that, you're making the more powerful, you're making the powerful more powerful. Amazon is now close to being one of the most, it's bigger than a lot of countries. So are you going to check? Are you going to leave that unchecked? At this point, it is a monopoly. That's not a free market. There is nothing free market about what Amazon does. Nothing. And in fact, they're using the profits from this monopoly to then force other competitors out of other businesses. Look at where Amazon and Bezos are going. They're going into other businesses, buying other businesses because they have a lot of money. Look at Apple. They're buying tons of businesses. They have a bunch of cash. So not only are they destroying the competition in the cell phone business, they're also at the same time taking over other businesses because they have the money to force other competitors out and create a monopoly in that industry and make that monopoly bigger. And, at some point, it has to be even beyond just trade issues, just from pure defense issues, from national security issues. At some point, you have to pull in the strings and recognize this isn't a free enterprise capitalistic system. This is a monopoly that's being governed or run by a large entity. It might not be another government like a communist country. It may, but it still is a large industry, a large business that is that that is able and is bigger uh, and more dangerous, I think, than even uh, other countries because of the power that it has, the control of the market that it has, the control of product delivery. If, for example, all of the masks in the world were controlled by Amazon, uh, and they decided that they weren't going to provide any masks because they didn't think that you needed to wear a mask in a pandemic, um, what's the chances that you could get other ones? Now, we had some businesses spring up, didn't we? And that's what happens when you allow somebody another choice. It is possible for an industry to become competitive. But what had to happen there? Well, to some degree, the price had to go up, and people had to agree that they wanted to buy an American product, not a Chinese product, because you can still get a Chinese mask for probably 20 cents a piece versus a nice cloth mask is costing you $10. So it's the only way that works long term is if people's needs or desires or buying pattern changes, and that large company can't adjust it. But in effect, they did. Still, a lot of those companies that jumped up, where did they end up selling their product? On Amazon. So Amazon could control that. What about Etsy or whatever? That's where some of this stuff went out, right? That was a new company trying to break in, but then at some point you have to follow their rules, and there's not a lot of alternatives. So I think it's important to understand what a free market system is and what it is not, and what happens if if you don't have a free market system. You have to control um, the components and regulate components where there is no free market. Now, there's different ways to regulate. One way to regulate is for the government to take over and just the government be the monopoly. Not really a good choice, because that's probably never going to, once government gets control of something, the chances of of you being able to get it back are limited. The other alternative is to create pockets of competition. I think President Trump was trying to do that in the healthcare area. What he was trying to do is recognize that if there were limited choices, that you get everybody gets the same product and there's no variance, that you have then limited choices and the price is going to stabilize, but it may stabilize high, which is what happened with the Affordable Care Act. Because every policy had to include everything, it forced a generic product that was too expensive for some people, because some people don't need all of that coverage, and so they didn't want to pay for it, and they didn't. So some people voluntarily tried to find a way not to get coverage, and other people, ended up having coverage that they didn't need, and they paid more for it. So money went to waste in that system. So when the president was trying to create these regional, because insurance is regulated at the state level, so that also keeps out competition. So one of the things the president did to increase competition in the Affordable Care area was to say, we're going to allow regional, instead of state exchanges, we're going to allow regional exchanges. In effect, we're going to allow regional companies that are approved to provide health insurance in other states to come into Florida, and they don't have to get permission from the state of Florida to do that. And then they created competition, even among Blue Cross, for example. Blue Cross is the big elephant in the room here in Florida. Blue Cross, Blue Shield of Florida, is the most powerful company in all of Florida, really, when it comes to anything. They control all of the healthcare in the state of Florida, because they also control Medicare and the distributions under Medicare. So nobody ever doesn't accept Blue Cross Blue Shield. I mean, because you got to, because then they'll come back and say, well, maybe your Medicare payments will be. And in the state of Florida, where 60 or 70% of the medical care is Medicare, you can't really tell the person that's paying you, we don't want to do business with you. So net effect is Blue Cross Blue Shield is very, very powerful. But when Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois comes down here, or Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan comes down here and wants to compete, now all of a sudden things change. And then also the president, didn't require certain coverages. If you were a 60-year-old woman and you didn't really feel you needed maternity coverage, you didn't have to get it. which I think was kind of a good idea. I don't understand why a 60-year-old woman would necessarily need maternity coverage, but that wasn't an option before. You weren't going to need it, but you were paying for it. So it created an inefficient market, and so the costs of that market were higher because of its inefficiency. And so what the president was trying to do was make that more competitive, recognizing that it is not competitive. The alternative, of course, is to go to a single payer and have the government be in charge, which would not be competitive at all because the government would dictate. So how you regulate a market also determines, where you're going to end up, and it determines whether that market will ever be competitive. If you create enough opportunities for companies to kind of hang around in a market, there may come a time when that market can refurbish and replenish and become more competitive. Now, what happens to reset a free economy? What has to happen to reset a free economy is a depression. And that's what we avoided in 2007. And the way we avoided it is by trying to regulate it so that it didn't happen. And by doing that, we picked the winners and the losers in the 2007 and 8 and longer recession. The market didn't choose. If the market had chose the winners and the losers, we would now have an efficient market. We would be much more effective. And as this next series of problems came about, we would have been better capable of dealing with it because some of the weak competitors would already be gone. They would already be out. And therefore, we would have been stronger financially going into this next wave of financial difficulty. But instead, we saved the banks, many of which were very, very weak competitors. And we saved them and, in fact, ingrained in them the process that they could create mistakes in the future and survive because we told them they were too big to fail. And now we've created a market that needs to be cleaned because it still has those weak competitors. The problem is that when this next depression comes, and it will come, those weak competitors that were saved will now be tougher to get rid of. And it's kind of like getting rid of the cancer cells. You're going to kill a lot of good cells in the process, unfortunately. And I think that's what's going to happen coming up. So we'll talk about that next week right here on Treasure Coast Solutions, where I get to talk about whatever I want because I pay for it. And that's the whole good thing about free enterprise. If you pay for it, you get to do stuff. Anyway, that's what it's all about right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's very, very, very old station.